2020, 2021, 2022, we're constantly seeing that the story continues to be COVID. But the reality is you started to see in 2021, and you're seeing it today, that supply chain disruptions are truly becoming the big story. That impact is resonating around the world and impacting economies, consumers, individuals, stock markets, and of course, enterprises around the world. So you know that there will be a next disruption. You know it's coming, but you don't know where and when. And what we wanted to do today is give you a view into a key disruption that we are concerned about at the Supply Wisdom think tank, share with you details on it, but also share with you solutions that can make you more resilient, can enhance your risk management program. So let me get started with this story. And this story is very much focused on the nexus of supply chain around China and Taiwan. 60% of the maritime trade passes through the South China Sea. And 22% of the global trade is affected by the South China Sea. So we know that this is massive, can have a massive impact. So what I wanted to do today was bring together expert on this and hopefully engage the audience. And please share ideas, provide your thoughts, ask questions, either through chat or Q&A. But I'm delighted to have one of my colleagues join me today. I have with me Victor Meyer. Victor Meyer is the Chief Customer Officer at Supply Wisdom. He came to Supply Wisdom years ago from Deutsche Bank, where he was the head of non-financial risk. So really managed risk, understood risk from a global perspective, from a global organization. But prior to that, he served in the Navy SEALs, so has a really good global understanding of logistics and intelligence, and has also served as a vice chair of the World Economic Forum's Pandemic Council. So really closely related to what we've been seeing for the last 2.5 years. I'm the chairman and founder and CEO of Supply Wisdom. A quick background about me. Not only have I been in the whole supply chain sourcing space for the last 30 years, but also have served on key boards such as the Defense Department, Shared Assessment, and others that I think have given me a really good insight into supply chain and supply chain issues around the world. So Victor, without further ado, let's kick in and let's talking about why this region matters first.
So thanks very much, Atul, for that introduction. The first thing I'd like to say about the Taiwan, China, and broader Asia Pacific nexus is the sheer scale of it. On a seasonally adjusted annual rate for 2021, U.S. imports comprise $635 billion in goods. And just to put that in context, that's 27% of the entire U.S. manufacturing base, and it's moving in the wrong direction. The next thing is the supply chain issue is concentrated, and it's concentrated on a wide variety of industry sectors or segments. So particularly in finished goods and electronics and in pharmaceuticals, where the Chinese production can comprise up to 50 or 60% of the total global production.
Right, Victor. I mean, very clearly, when you start to see the impact that the Chinese economy has around the world, both as an exporter, but also an importer. So this gives you kind of an idea of, hey, how is the globe, how are these countries around the world engaged with China? Take a look at the size of the trade that occurs with US, with India, Australia, Brazil, Chile, Hong Kong, of course, now part of China, South Korea, Japan, and then you shift to Europe, Germany, Netherlands, UK. And you start to see this picture that the global trade, I know we talk about it, but this visually puts into a very strong light of how connected, how dependent all of us are. And in this case, what that tie goes back to China. So Victor, what I thought we would do is maybe spend time focused around some key industries. You might hear the word infrastructure, key infrastructure, or words as such. These are industries that not just a single industry, but many, many industries depend on, even critical to defense and others. So let's talk about some of them, Victor. The first one that comes to mind for me, Victor, is the chip industry. We, of course, saw President Biden just recently sign the CHIPS Act. Talk to us a little bit about kind of the state of the chip industry and some of the challenges that you see there.
Thanks, Atul. Well, first and foremost, as a result of the pandemic, this sector in particular has not achieved pre-pandemic production levels. This is due to labor shortages, and as well a degree of effort to diversify the supply chain. If you look at global semiconductor production capacity, it appears to be well diversified until you start to look at the foundry capacity, which is extremely concentrated in China, Korea, and in, of course, Taiwan, which has 51% of global foundry production for microchips, concentrated in one single firm, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. That's 50% of capacity for the entire global foundry production for microprocessors.
So this starts to highlight to you is that if you have assets of production in a critical industry that are concentrated in a region, which in this case happens to be Asia, and to a large extent concentrated among firms or locations, they may not be friendly, that you can see what that impact is and why the CHIPS project or the CHIPS law came into place to take some of the reliance away from these locations. They may not be as friendly to locations that are friendly. But at the same time, we know that chip production is not a 12, 24-month issue. We're talking about decade, right? From planning to production to actually delivering, we're talking about that process often takes a decade or more. So we know that that's one of the industries as an example. Now, I'm not going to go through each and every industry, but I wanted to illustrate how in certain industries, how dependent we are in this nexus that we're talking about, China, Taiwan, and why, if there's any disruption of trade in that area, which by the way is occurring today, how that impacts us. The next one we wanted to kind of share with you is first kind of just look at the trade between US and China. Victor, what stands out for you when you start looking at this trade between the two countries?
So this is what I was trying to point out when I said that there's a deep concentration across a number of sectors. I think this is a result as well. If you look at what we export, much of our exports, the number one export is commercial aircraft, but soya and other agricultural products, pork as well, comprises a large portion of those exports. The U.S. simply has very little U.S. domestic manufacturing capacity. In fact, the orders for manufactured goods, manufacturing goods orders in the U.S. In 2022 are at 1992 levels, and in 1992. The economy in 2022 is 4 times the size. So you can get a sense of the scale of the deterioration in U.S. domestic manufacturing and the dependency in particular on China for those self-same manufactured goods.
Yeah, the other thing that stands out for me is when you start looking at the left side, which is the imports from China, and you start to realize there's significant amount of electronics involved. And then you recognize that electronics production, and again, these goes into all kinds of things, right? From laptops to phones to automobile. And you talk about any smart device, any IoT device that we out there, then you start to recognize that for all those industries that I just talked about, there's a need for rare earth minerals in many of these cases. And then where is that concentration? So you start to see, as the word that was used before for semiconductors is a choke point, well, you start to realize in many of those rare earth minerals, we don't necessarily have the mining or production capacity. We might have the deposits. In many of our allies, we might have the deposits, but that's not where the production is today. It happens to be in countries that potentially are not friendly, that could have a massive interruption to it. So we talked about chips, we talked about rare earth. And then the next one that stands out for me, Victor, is pharmaceuticals, antibiotics. And you start to realize, and I use an example here. This is an example from India from 2020, where you realize that 100% of the source for penicillin, and then for the other APIs that you can see, and then others like tetracycline were 77%, a very, very high reliance on imports from China. Victor, any comments as you think about, we're just using 3 different industries, but you start to see the heavy reliance and the potential for disruption there.
Yeah, it really does require a peeling back of the onion. This is quite alarming, actually, but it's not that dependency, that critical dependency, is not limited to antibiotics alone. It runs across the spectrum in healthcare, life sciences, and pharma. For example, GE has a large medical dye. It's actually called contrast media, but it's medical dye for example, MRIs. They've sole-sided their production in Shanghai. Of course, Shanghai has seen, as part of China's zero COVID policy, has seen massive lockdowns that have occurred for over several months. By contrast, Bayer has diversified their production. They compete. They're the only other major competitor in this particular. They've diversified their production, and so are not seeing similar degrees of deterioration in their supply chain integrity.
Right. So you start to see that, often people get focused on a few things, cybersecurity or what is COVID doing, and you realize that there's actually multiple threats, multiple issues that are having a challenge to a China-centric supply chain. Think about the trade sanctions, impact of the CHIPS Act, the Forced Labor Prevention Act in the Xinjiang because of Xinjiang region issues. We're seeing multiple shutdowns, sometimes not just once, but over a period of 18 months, twice in areas like Shanghai and others because of China's zero COVID policy that basically focuses on the migration of labor, logistics, and transportation and shuts it down. And then, of course, China is also responding to the actions that they are seeing from other companies, other countries, such as the China's anti-foreign sanctions law, the military exercises that are being conducted right now across the Taiwan Strait. So you start to see multiple disruptions actually potentially occurring because of all the different factors coming in. So I think one of the points we're trying to make to everybody on this webinar is your aperture for risk identification needs to be a lot broader. We'll talk more about solutions, but I'm hoping you're getting the point. I want to make a few more observations before we start talking about, hey, what's a good solution? What should enterprises be doing to be more resilient, to be better at risk management? I want to share a few other things from CNBC recently about, this is data from June 2022. What is happening in supply chains around specific cities as an example, especially when you think about vessels, containers, trucks, time in port. The thing often people don't realize is prior to COVID, when global trade was humming, these containers would actually have a journey around the world. I'm just focused on maritime right now, right? I could be talking about air travel for that matter. But let's talk about shipping as an example, because it's such a major part of the supply chain. These containers would move around the world, right? Export, import. And so they would basically be in this circulation that enabled all these ports to be efficient, all these suppliers to be efficient, and thus getting those goods to customers. What has happened is that COVID actually disrupted this. But more importantly, depending on what policies countries picked, their rate of vaccination, rate of infection, all those made a difference. Did you know when Shanghai was closed? Did you know when Xi'an was closed or when it opened? Did you know which factories were impacted because of that? What did those factories make that impacted, as Victor just used, supply of dye through GE Healthcare to those hospitals that all of a sudden had to delay their procedures, which impacted their revenue? Of course, more importantly, impacted care. How do you see that? That's the view of China's supply chain. You can see there's significant congestion in many different areas. Now see the same view as an example for Europe. What is Europe facing because of those challenges? Well, availability of containers. They have trucking issues because availability of drivers. What's the impact now on the other side in the US? Well, you're seeing congestion in some ports, right? You're seeing congestion or vehicle turnaround issues in certain areas. Now, you start to think about and recognize, hey, how do I make sure that I'm understanding all these changes that are taking place? I know, Victor, as a risk leader, as a risk manager, when you think about your days running, this massive risk to the bank, a global bank, talk to us a little bit about, are you seeing risk multiplying, and could a further escalation make it worse?
Well, I think I told to the points that you made on the previous slide. I think one of the things we need to understand is the just how badly it destabilized the supply chain, in particular, that China, how bad the impact was. And a large part of that was their lack of access to the mRNA vaccines, which are, of course, far more effective than non-mRNA vaccines. And when you inject sort of the recent events and tensions between China and Taiwan, and you spoke specifically about shipping. If the shooting, the live fire exercises continue in the South China Sea, you'll see sort of a reluctance of insurance companies to underwrite. That'll further exacerbate that time in port and availability of vessels and containers.
Right. So to the audience, as you're hearing us talk about this, please share your observations. Please ask questions. What would you like to know more? Because I'm going to kind of transition from, the state of the world because of this nexus in that region, and then start talking about, hey, what are solutions? What could we be doing? But Victor, first, I think the point that when you and I were kind of preparing for this, as we were talking about this, your point is, hey, we have supply chain issues today. Even if there's a détente, it's not disappearing. Talk to us about on the other two ends and why we should still care about the fact or prepare for disruptions.
So I think Atul, in my experience, had a non-financial risk at Deutsche Bank. Businesses have historically been poor at pricing catastrophic risk. It's in fact, pandemic, I'm familiar with a couple of European banks that pandemic was actually pulled out of their risk register for their capital calculations. So it's not in their loss history, and so they typically tend to underprice the risk. It's also, they're disincentivized to do it, particularly financial services firms, because it consumes operational risk capital, or it's seen as force majeure for some other firms. There's nothing I can really do about it. But I think it's important to understand there actually is something you can do about it, and regulators are expecting firms to do things, to do something about it across, whether that's in healthcare, life sciences, pharmaceutical, or financial services, and in banking and insurance. Regardless of which scenario you subscribe to, it's important as a function of firm risk appetite to develop worst, best, and base case scenarios, and to have a portfolio level view, as well have a regional overlay, so you know what production you have where, and what the impact is if you lose that percentage of production, or if you have 100% concentration, as we saw in the case with GE.
Yeah, right. And Victor, I think the point you're trying to make also is that irrespective of whatever that scenario is, every evidence points to increased disruptions which means, and often in our view, we work with a significant amount of global enterprises, and we've been in this field for a while. These are not black swan events. You literally can see this coming. When you think about right now, live fire exercises that China is conducting and now cyber attacks, well, we knew this. We knew that one of the vectors that would take place would be, tariffs. We know one of the vectors that's going to take place is threatening, like Russia not providing power to certain countries, or the fact that there's potential cyber attacks that are occurring. So we know that certain things, you can predict it, and if you prepare for it, you can be resilient. So very clearly, the question people always ask us is, with so much going on, how can you stay on top of all those risks that are emerging? You absolutely can. That is the beauty of today's tech. Our ability to leverage automation, machine learning, and the tremendous amount of information that exists in open source, to be able to use that intelligence and data science to deliver it to customers as real-time, accurate knowledge, often in advance, early warning, so you can take action. So let's talk about step-by-step, Victor, because we see companies who are taking on these solutions and actually creating really amazing, resilient organizations and improving their risk management practices. So the old world practice of assessments, questionnaires, becomes stale very quickly. But unfortunately, more and more organizations double down on it. When major incident happens, what do? They ask the next question. They send another 5 questions, another 10 questions to find out what's going on. By the time the responses come, the risk vector is something else. So we can't depend on these old practices of assessments that become stale very quickly. One of the other things, Victor, I'm going to ask you to comment on is, because I know you've always been a huge proponent of location risk. And so the first solution is, are companies actually considering location risk in their risk management, in their procurement models? We know that companies are doing assessments of their suppliers and third parties in their supply chain, but have you really intersected that with location risk? So Victor, talk to us about the importance of location risk, and then we can present the model in terms of how can one actually look and monitor location risk.
So Atul, I think one of the things I would say is over the last couple of years, firms have actually gotten better at risk management in the third-party space. Unfortunately, they've largely confined their attention to cybersecurity and to financial risk, as we saw as we see every day with climate change, as we saw with pandemic, with Russia, Ukraine, and now China, Taiwan. It's necessary to look far beyond just a narrow risk aperture and into the area of geopolitical risk and indeed business and operations risks. Second, a realization of some of the vulnerabilities in the supply chain over the last couple of years have resulted in efforts to some of these are driven actually by regulation and by law, to re-engineer supply chain and to reshore certain activities. That further destabilizes the supply chain and requires continuous monitoring of potential deteriorations, lest a catastrophic supplier loss ensue with no previous warnings. And firms simply can't back into location risks. So if they do reshore something, for example, from Russia, from Ukraine, which has had a very large tech sector, into Eastern Europe, we've seen material real estate inflation rates and wars on talent, as everybody's competing for the same talent assets, and therefore wage inflation rates go off the chart. So the location risk component and the overall risk profile is extremely important. It's not enough to focus on just on the cyber and financial risks.
Right. And this is, Victor, this is a good model when one can use to think about how do I make sure that while I'm monitoring the health of my supplier, financial, cyber, operations, compliance, ESG, is to also understand what is the health of the location where I'm being provided services. Victor used a great example about the dye manufacturing, Shanghai and that in that region. Well, if that region is shut down, your reliable dye supply is no longer happening. That is going to be used in hospitals, which means if I'm a healthcare system, I need to be able to not just monitor GE Healthcare, but what locations is my critical material supply, or it could be tech coming from, right? So this becomes a good model to be able to get a complete view of the health of a particular location. So I think that's the first thing that companies have to think about is, hey, well, what am I doing about location risk? And do I understand that very clearly? So Victor, the second one we talked about was the intersection of risks, right? It's not just about knowing that location risk, but truly, are you understanding how that location risk shows up in your supply chain, right? So we go back to the example that we just used, which is how is that dye example, why does Shanghai play a role in it? So if you were monitoring GE Healthcare and Shanghai in this case, you would understand, knew which part of that product or manufacturing or services supply chain was going to be impacted. You would know that ahead of time. You would know that when the shutdown occurs, or when they're discussing it, or when you see the infection rates go up. That might be even an earlier warning for that matter, knowing that China has implemented a zero COVID policy. Okay? Any comments on the intersection of risk, Victor?
Yeah, Atul. I mean, if you have you might have an example of where the geopolitical component simply has to be included in the overall risk profile of a third party exposure. Sri Lanka is a great example. We've seen firms that had some exposure to suppliers in Sri Lanka, and those suppliers' financial conditions pre sovereign crisis in Sri Lanka were sound. Nevertheless, the collapse, and I don't think I overstate it by calling it literally the collapse of Sri Lanka, has put extreme stresses on suppliers that, had they been in India or another location in South Asia, would have been perfectly okay.
Yeah. So I think this illustrates the point, many points that Victor just talked about is, first, financial and cyber risk is not enough if you are trying to understand the health of your third parties. What's their operations health, which is health of their employees, health of their customers, their infrastructure, compliance. We're seeing massive impact from ESG. Are they operating from locations that have water issues? And in China, for example, zero COVID policy has an impact both from a compliance and ESG perspective. And then this whole nth party, right? What is that ecosystem of that third party that you are leveraging? And how does all of this, right, intersect with location? Because the health of the location impacts all these others. So the first being, make sure you have location risk in your risk framework. The second is the whole intersection of risk. How are these risks kind of intersecting with location risk? And then the third becomes this whole concept of cascading risk. And this is an area that we've been spending a lot of time on. Why? Because we have very clearly come to the conclusion that if you had good practices in terms of monitoring early indicators, you can actually prevent catastrophic issues down the road. In most cases, when we have done lookbacks, cyber risk never started as a cyber issue. It dominoed to a cyber issue. It started with reduction in investments because of a financial issue, or loss of significant leadership and team, which is expertise, loss of a client, moving operations to a cyber challenge location such as Belarus. That was one of the challenges with Kaseya as an example. And so you can go back often 6 months, 9 months, if you were monitoring this. Even in cyber, understanding leak credentials, right? Compromised domains, right? Patch management issues. If you're monitoring those, they lead to a cyber ransomware, data loss, and other issues. So we think about cascading risk as early warnings that if you take actions, if you understand these vectors, you can actually avoid many catastrophic issues. Victor, any thoughts on cascading risk, kind of how you think about it? I know you were also talking to me about concentration as an example.
Well, Atul, I think I made the point earlier about catastrophic risks. So severe risks have a number of different attributes. These so-called catastrophic risks have a number of different attributes to them. One of them is they tend to be cascading. So we see firms in the industry that are increasingly looking at wanting to be predictive. So identifying how risks might cascade. Some of them are, for example, looking at risks in their profile, in their risk profile, on a portfolio level and at an individual critical supplier level in particular, and they're saying, let's do a pre-mortem. What would happen if we had a worst case scenario with the supplier or location, a best case scenario, and a base case scenario? It helps you to visualize how the crystallization events might occur based on existing exposure.
Yeah, this is that risk management discipline on tabletop exercises, simulations, and then having a playbook, right? So if you had a good playbook that said, when the financial health of my third party is compromised, I need to do a review of their employee health. I need to do a review of their cyber, because we know those are going to be the next set of domino effects. And how will that impact me if they lose key talent, if they have cyber issues, right? So that then all of a sudden you recognize that early action might actually avoid that catastrophic issue down the road. So Victor, location framework, intersection of risk, cascading risk, and then the fourth discipline we talked about was, well, make sure you know how to assess risk, right? And some of in this case right now is, do you have an inventory of what your risk exposure to China, Taiwan is? Not just to your third party, but also in your supply chain, in your nth parties. What is that exposure? Right? So you're kind of going into your supply chain, looking at fourth parties. And then what are the cascading effects of above? Well, if a certain source dries up, right, maybe further down the supply chain, what impact does that have? I mean, think about it. I was just, recently looking at how China basically said, I am not going to be exporting sand to Taiwan. This is because of the recent issue. Well, what does that mean? That means it actually affects chip production, literally, right? But if you didn't follow that in your supply chain, you would not understand that. So really understanding kind of what are the cascading effects of above, like does it unstable the supply chains? Does it change forecasts? Is it going to increase my costs? So Victor, talk to us a little bit because, you did this, right? You did this. I remember you talking to me about the pandemic, even before it was a major issue. I remember, for example, we sent out our first alert on Wuhan viral pneumonia on January 2nd. And in fact, in our guidance, we had told customers, you may need to quarantine and collaborate with local health agencies. This was on January 2, 2020. Talk to us about how that kind of risk thinking, Victor, kind of becomes part of an organization's DNA.
Well, I think the pandemic, first and foremost, the pandemic showed us that risk profiles can change materially in a very, very short period of time. The second is the importance of the geopolitical component. Disruptive events very, very often have a regional component. And so a better understanding, it requires, and to allow for that, requires a better, a deeper, a more sophisticated understanding on a front to back basis, and less dependency on a point in time questionnaire based approach. that will not give you that will be lacking in key data points. So leveraging artificial intelligence and leveraging open source intelligence enabled by artificial intelligence to identify throughout the third party life cycle from vendor onboarding all the way to vendor offboarding is the way I see the third party risk management discipline and supply chain risk management discipline progressing.
Right. So Victor, one of the questions from the audience was about, how do all these disruptions impact patient safety? We deal with a number of healthcare organizations. Maybe the easiest way for me to answer that is, we used an example, just the example of the dye. What did it do? Many hospitals, many healthcare providers had to postpone surgeries, had to postpone diagnosis, right? Had to postpone health checks because they could not do CAT scans or not the volume that they were originally able to do because of lack of supplies. And so if you think about the points we made, right, which is the cascading effect, that was a very clear example of a cascading effect that you start to see. So what Victor and I, by the way, please, ask more questions, share your ideas. So what Victor and I have just kind of taken you through is this whole importance of understanding location risk, kind of the intersection of location risk with other risk factors. So open up your risk vectors. We talked about cascading risks, right? We talked about the importance of risk analysis. Well, as I said before, all of these things will benefit you, but if your focus is still a point in time, right, then you're not getting access to what's occurring today, right? Fact that Shanghai was closed down 30 days ago doesn't help you today because you've already suffered all the impact of it. But if you knew it 2 days before they shut it down because they announced it, or 2 weeks ago when you saw the infection rates go up, then that makes a huge difference. And so this is this whole concept of how do you move from static data to actually real-time continuous risk intelligence. This is a key discipline that one needs to have in place to be able to make sure you have an accurate picture of what that risk vector, what all those risks are being identified happen to be now or coming in the near future, right? Early warning. So Victor talked to us about this whole move and why companies, enterprises need to move from a static assessment methodology to a real-time continuous risk intelligence methodology approach.
So there was a question, I believe, on the pharmaceutical supply chain, and I think the pandemic example continues to be illustrative. I believe the Biden administration pivoted very, very quickly on pandemic onset to order a 100-day review that resulted in 2 executive orders, the 14001, 14017, and a further 1-year review, and then a national strategy for a resilient public health supply chain that was published in July was published last summer. Therein are a number of excellent recommendations for anybody that is interested in a more resilient supply chain, but it boils down to more frequent updates, open source intelligence, and radical transparency in the supply chain so that these concentrations are addressed early, so that they can be so that firms can diversify away from them, so that they are less subject to for example, a Russia-Ukraine or a China-Taiwan conflict or potential conflict.
Right. And hopefully the point that we talked about was that as you move to a real-time intelligence system, now across what we call full spectrum, right? We talked about the 7 risk domains of financial, cyber, compliance, operations, ESG, location, and nth party. Across all these domains, as you think about ensuring that your intelligence is real-time and continuous. And so I always think about is that with all this, you result in 3 things. If you want to remember kind of the power of 3 in this case is, you're ensuring radical transparency. You're doing proactive vigilance. And finally, that enables you to do agile intervention. So if you want to remember that, radical transparency, proactive vigilance, agile intervention. And now let's just finally kind of maybe summarize, Victor, for our audience into, hey, what are some of the urgent steps that you ought to do, right? I mean, think about how fast the Ukraine-Russia issue unfolded once it did, but there was plenty of warning. And what we're saying to you all today is there's plenty of warning. Irrespective of whether this is going to be a massive negative event, one thing we do know that there will be continued supply chain disruption because of the China, Taiwan, and simply the policies of nations such as the US and others, and the policies of China that will continue to have impact on supply chain. So Victor, what I wanted to do is maybe you can help us summarize urgent steps that enterprises here should take in the identify, monitor, and respond categories. Maybe we'll start with the first one.
So I really do like rules of thumb. And I think when you look across the portfolio and to put together the various risk actions that need to be included in a mature risk management program in the third party or supply chain space, identify, assess, measure, manage, communicate, and report. Or if you roll that up, identify, monitor, and respond. I really like after action reviews. So identifying areas where you've had a near miss, for example, or an actual supply chain issue, and doing a read across other areas of the business or other geographies where you may have a similar exposure. As I said, the point in time risk assessments and monitoring are simply not sufficient. The monitoring needs to be done on a continuing basis to address risk exposures early before they are in excess to risk appetite. And then a resilience operations center approach where risks are identified, remediation plans to put in place compensating controls or remediating existing controls or introducing additional controls into the controls inventory to establish a path to green or a path back within risk tolerance.
Right. So hopefully, to the audience, it gives you kind of a roadmap in terms of what should you identify, what should you monitor, and then how can you actually respond. So this is the end of the webinar. I'm going to spend another 10 minutes having a conversation with Victor, but the next set of the conversation is going to be very specifically about supply wisdom. So the non-advertising part of the session is over, but I do want you to understand what capability can you access. So this is not just talk, this is not just hope, this is not a future solution. Solutions like this actually exist today. So Victor, let's talk about this. So one of the key things that the company that I founded, Supply Wisdom, that we did is we said that risk intelligence can be real-time and continuous, and assessments are not doing their job. So one of the first things we did is we actually built a risk model, and we identified these 7 risk domains. And in fact, we got a patent from the US Patent Office in May of 2020 for this system of risk management. And for all of these 7 risk domains, we enable today in real time and continuously metrics, ratings, risk events, which is alerts, and risk actions. So you can actually automate all the way from risk identification to risk management. And so that the risk management teams that companies have can actually focus their energies not in trying to identify risk, not trying to synthesize that, but actually focus their intelligence, their experience, their effort on mitigating the biggest risk that the company actually faces, and the system actually supports that. We found that with data science, machine learning, and AI, you can actually reduce the noise that exists there, increase accuracy, reliability, and timeliness, and be able to integrate all this through open APIs into a company's own system. To just show our good faith, and Victor, I'm going to ask you to comment on this, just to show our good faith, we're providing a free report to anybody, right? Just reach out. You see the email there or the phone, reach out. because we want you to be able to experience this. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed this during COVID and now during the Ukraine crisis, we've made our alerts related to those open and available as a free source to anybody that registers on our website. I also want to share with you some additional resources that you can download from the website. People often ask us about, hey, how do I accelerate my supplier due diligence? How do I move to a continuous risk management program? All these resources are available online. Victor, any comments, any thoughts on supply wisdom? Anything else you want to share? What you're hearing from customers, what kind of problems you're solving?
Just one last thought, Atul. Back when I was in non-financial risk at Deutsche Bank, there was a regularly occurring event. A non-executive director would read an article in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, et cetera, and would say, this was a serious risk crystallization event. Could it happen at the firm where I'm a non-executive director? I would urge the participants in the call to ask themselves if they're ready to answer that question, if they have the tools and the intelligence to answer that question. What was the industry impact? Could that particular risk concentration affect our firm in the same way as it affected this example in the industry?
Absolutely. So I'm going to end with just a couple of thoughts. I urge the audience, this is going to be live on LinkedIn and I think also on YouTube. Engage with it, ask questions, share your ideas. We would love to hear from you on what's working for you. The important thing to think about is that these solutions, this real-time risk intelligence can fundamentally help you with early warning, can prepare you to have better information on anybody you're sourcing or procuring today. Anytime your risk threshold hits a point that tells you that you need to start preparing. So it can actually help you be an early warning also when changes are required, whether it's simply monitoring or switching a third party. And of course, in your ongoing vendor management, governance, risk management programs, you actually have rich information to have these discussions. And finally, let me end by saying, if you have any other topics you want to hear from us on, a region you care about, or an industry or a supply chain you're concerned about, please write to us. You have our email, you have our phone number. We look forward to talking to you and sharing more from our Supply Wisdom think tank. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Victor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.